Today's subject is a man whose steady gaze anchored some of Hollywood's greatest classics, whose name rolled across marquees for decades, and whose performances defined an era of American cinema. Glenn Ford. He was the rugged leading man who could smolder in film noir shadows, ride tall in westerns, and still bring tenderness to the quiet corners of a scene. But behind the sharp suits, the studio contracts, and the whirlwind premieres, Glenn Ford's most enduring legacy didn't come from fame. It came from family. While the world knew him as the dependable star of Columbia Pictures, he quietly raised one son, Peter Ford, a child who grew up not in the glow of Klieg lights, but in the quieter, more complicated orbit of a father balancing war service, stardom, and late-night shoots. Glenn's career spanned more than 100 films. Yet at home, he was simply Dad, the man who came back from sets smelling of stage makeup, the man who navigated divorce and heartbreak, but still made time to be present, to teach, to listen. He wasn't perfect, marriages ended, affairs made headlines, but to his son, he was never just a Hollywood myth. He was the steady presence in a private world, far removed from box office numbers. And in the end, long after the camera stopped rolling and the applause faded, Glenn Ford was remembered not just for the roles that made him a star, but for the way he loved and shaped the life of his only child. This is the story of Glenn Ford and what happened to the son of a Hollywood legend. Peter Ford was born in 1945 inside a Los Angeles mansion where laughter from his parents mixed with the distant hum of studio cameras. He grew up among glittering Hollywood gatherings, often carried by his father Glenn Ford, out onto the balcony to watch rows of press cars lining the gate. His mother, Eleanor Powell, was a celebrated dance star, and his father's name was climbing marquees, giving the illusion of a perfect family sealed in fame. But one late night, as little Peter wandered the hall looking for his mother, he paused by a half-closed door and heard his father in a heated argument with an unfamiliar woman on the phone. That moment shattered the picture book image, planting in him the first quiet understanding that his family world was far more complicated than the photographs suggested. By the early 1950s, Peter entered grade school carrying a last name everyone recognized, and with it came whispers that followed him down every hallway. Glenn Ford's films were box office draws, but magazines also splashed rumors of on-set romances and late-night escapades, stories that classmates repeated with a mix of awe and cruelty. Peter tried to ignore the headlines, clutching his lunch pail and pretending not to hear, when another boy joked that his dad had a new movie girlfriend. At home, Eleanor Powell drilled discipline into him, insisting on homework before play, yet her face tightened each time a tabloid arrived in the mail. Then one afternoon at recess, Peter spotted a fresh issue left on a bench. Its cover froze him cold. A photo of Glenn Ford walking hand in hand with an actress he had claimed was just a colleague. In that instant, pride turned into confusion, and the boy who carried a famous name felt the sting of a shadow he never asked for. By the mid-1950s, Peter stepped into his teenage years straddling two worlds, the routine of a private school and the electric pull of Hollywood sets. Glenn Ford was at the height of his career, moving from noir thrillers to Western epics, often absent for weeks, sending home brief calls that never filled the gap. Peter, lanky and restless, began tagging along on studio visits, hoping to feel closer to his father, only to sense how distant Glenn seemed amid the buzzing crew and camera lights. At home, classmates teasing about new gossip columns still echoed, and the boy wondered if any of it was true. Then came the day Peter wandered backstage during a shoot and caught sight of his father, arms draped casually around a young actress, both laughing in a way that felt too intimate. That single glimpse hit him harder than any headline. In that instant, admiration twisted into unease, and the distance between father and son silently grew wider. In 1959, when Peter was just 14, the facade of stability finally cracked as Glenn Ford and Eleanor Powell's divorce splashed across every newspaper in Los Angeles. Outside their home, reporters crowded the driveway, shouting questions that made neighbors stop and stare. While at school, Peter endured classmates repeating cruel headlines as if they were jokes. He watched his mother hold her posture with icy grace, even as she sifted through legal papers late at night. And he noticed his father arriving home with a tired smile that no longer reached his eyes. Then came a revelation that deepened the wound. During a tense family meeting, Peter overheard a lawyer mention another property Glenn had quietly placed under a woman's name, a detail hidden from Eleanor and from him. That single disclosure pierced deeper than the public scandal, teaching Peter that the man celebrated on marquees was far more complicated than the father he thought he knew by the early 1960s. As Peter entered his late teens and early 20s, he tried to carve out his own path, while the weight of his father's reputation lingered everywhere he went. He took small jobs around film sets, hauling cables and fetching coffee, hoping to prove he belonged on merit. Not because of his last name, Glenn occasionally stopped by, offering advice that felt more like distant orders than encouragement. His presence commanding respect from everyone on set, but never easing Peter's own insecurity. He watched crew members exchange knowing glances when Glenn's past affairs came up in whispers, and Peter kept his head down, determined not to ride his father's coattails. Then came the twist he never saw coming. After a long day applying for production work, he was hired instantly only to overhear the producer say in the hallway, "It's good press to have Glenn Ford's boy on board." The compliment felt like a sting, making him realize how hard it would be to step out of a shadow that followed him into every room. By the 1970s, Peter had already tested the waters of acting with a few minor roles, but every time his name appeared in a credit list, critics casually tied it back to Glenn Ford, as if talent itself was inherited. Tired of the comparisons, he quietly shifted gears, moving behind the camera into production work, determined to build something separate from the world that had defined his childhood. Glenn, still starring in westerns and thrillers, offered polite approval, but never hid his expectation that Peter should chase stardom, an unspoken tension that colored every father-son conversation. For a while, Peter found purpose in arranging schedules and managing shoots, until a budget meeting blindsided him. The studio suddenly diverted funds from his project to prioritize a new film led by Glenn Ford. That moment struck with cruel irony, the son's hard-earned effort sacrificed for the father's enduring fame. And Peter walked out of the office knowing that even far from the spotlight, his father's shadow could still swallow his plans whole by the early 1980s. Peter stepped away from the relentless chase of Hollywood credits and focused on building a life of his own, marrying and welcoming his first child with a quiet pride he had never seen in the glittering parties of his youth. He carried memories of Glenn Ford returning home, exhausted after night shoots, still carrying the scent of makeup and whispers of tabloid drama, and vowed that his own children would never feel that same distance. Family dinners became a ritual, a promise to himself that career ambitions would not eclipse bedtime stories or school recitals. Yet even in this calm, a reminder of the old chaos struck one evening when news broke that Glenn had been seen drunk at a nightclub, escorted out with a young actress on his arm. Peter sat silently in his living room, holding his newborn, realizing that no matter how far he tried to move from Hollywood scandals, his father's actions still had the power to ripple into his own home. By the early 1990s, Peter felt a pull to confront the legacy that had shaped him, deciding to write the book that would become Glenn Ford. Life nights were spent digging through boxes of letters, studio contracts, and faded photographs, each discovery stirring memories both warm and painful. He wanted to capture the father he knew, not the man the tabloids twisted into headlines. And yet the deeper he went, the more contradictions emerged. Glenn's charm was undeniable, but so were the scars left by choices that hurt those closest to him. Then, buried under old tax records, Peter found a folded letter in his father's handwriting, an unsent apology addressed to Eleanor Powell, filled with remorse and tenderness that Glenn had never voiced aloud. That plot twist hit Peter like a wave, rewriting years of anger and softening the image of a man who, behind fame and mistakes, had quietly carried regret he never shared with the world. In the early 2000s, Peter stepped fully into the role of preserving his father's legacy, attending film retrospectives and sitting on panels where Glenn Ford's name drew reverent applause. He curated archives, loaned memorabilia to museums, and spoke candidly about the man behind the camera, balancing honesty with respect. Invitations poured in from festivals eager to honor Glenn's westerns and noir classics, and Peter became the bridge between generations of moviegoers and the star they admired. Yet during one live interview, a journalist unveiled a little-known revelation. Glenn had quietly supported a struggling actress for years, paying her medical bills and tuition without ever seeking credit. The audience gasped, and Peter himself was stunned, realizing there were corners of his father's life still hidden even from him. That twist deepened his understanding that Glenn Ford's legacy was not just in the films or the scandals, but in quiet acts that complicated and humanized the man he had spent decades trying to truly know today, well into his late 70s. Peter lives a quieter life, far from the frantic pace of the studios, yet his days are still touched by the legacy of Glenn Ford. He occasionally appears at small screenings or charity events, speaking with a calm authority shaped by decades of watching fame up close and feeling its weight. His own children are grown, and he often reflects on the promise he kept to give them a steadier home than the one he knew. In private moments, he sifts through old photographs, lingering on one image of his father lifting him high above a crowd, both smiling as if the world outside didn't exist. Then not long ago at a tribute night, a gray-haired fan approached with a worn envelope and handed Peter a snapshot never seen before. Glenn Ford holding a toddler Peter on a studio lot, laughing with pure joy. That unexpected gift, a twist from a stranger, reminded him that beyond the headlines, the roles and the drama, his father's truest legacy lived in those fleeting, genuine moments that time could never erase one child. While the world saw Glenn as the steady hero of westerns and noir classics, Peter saw the man who stumbled, recovered, and kept building a life beyond the cameras. His father gave audiences unforgettable roles. Peter gave him something quieter: memory, protection, and a legacy stitched together from both triumphs and regrets. If you found this story meaningful and want more deep dives into the hidden lives behind America's most iconic families, subscribe to Legacy Uncovered. Your support helps bring the forgotten side of fame to light. Thanks for listening.